graffiti on quilts, and it looks great. Karlee Porter will show you how to unleash your creativity by taking your favorite doodles and turning them into a quilted masterpiece. Karlee, 4 years ago when we met, you didn't have your book out. Graffiti quilting was in its infancy. You hadn't been on your grand tour with graffiti quilting all over the world. And now here we are, and you bring this into the studio? I can't believe you've come this far. And we'll talk about that later, right?
Yep.
Tell me about the progression.
Well, it's been a long time coming, honestly. Some of it within quilting and some of it drawing when I didn't even know I was going to apply it to quilting yet. So it's been definitely a long time in the process. I'd say probably 12 years or so, even though the book's only been out 4 years now.
Where did the roots of it start?
Well, I have always been artistic. You know, as a young kid, that was kind of the only thing I was good at was coloring and drawing. And so I was always immersed in art in school. That was always the main thing that I wanted to do. And so I just, you know, kept sketchbooks and I would art journal all the time. And then in 2009, when I learned that quilting machines are a thing, everything was history from there. And I just started putting all of my sketches onto fabric with thread instead of keeping them in my sketchbooks.
Oh, so it's just a medium for what was going on in you anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I like to introduce myself as an artist who happens to use fabric and thread opposed to a quilter who makes art quilts.
Got it.
Because I've always been an artist, I just happen to use fabric and thread now.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So you have, you started with doing all this drawing, and you discovered thread, and then you wrote the book.
Right.
The first book,
Right.
and you've done an update to it, too.
Yes, I have. So I wanted to take you on a little journey.
Okay.
Way back from the very beginning. So I brought some of my old sketchbooks to show you, and no judgments. This is a judgment-free zone because there's nothing in here revolutionary, but it was really paving the way for what is revolutionary, which is graffiti quilting.
Well, and I think that's what's so instructional to our viewers, that it looks like it's nothing in the beginning and look what happened. 'Cause it's a process.
Yeah, and everyone comes from humble beginnings in terms of, you know, your artistic ability. So I'm gonna be vulnerable and share mine with you.
Thank you, we appreciate it.
So this was one of my very first journals that I got right at the beginning of high school. And I wanted to show you one of the designs that I would draw because I quilt it all the time now. So
crazy.
these are just, I call them Karlee curls now because I feel like I can't do a quilt without putting curls in it. But you can see very rudimentary, not very good looking drawings of curls, and that's kind of a recurring theme throughout my work. And so that was one of the first quilting designs that when I started quilting, I thought I gotta figure out how to do this design on fabric.
Yes.
And so that was kind of, it's dear to my heart because it's one of the first quilting designs that I felt like I mastered.
Wow.
So this was kind of my first journal, and then throughout the years, the process got a little better with each one. So this is my second journal, and this one's just kind of funny. This was a iPod cover that was starting to peel off my iPad, so I peeled it off and slapped it in my journal and just drew lots of crazy designs around it. And you can start to see kind of the resemblance with graffiti quilting, obviously a lot less organized, but just kind of the act of smushing a lot of different shapes and motifs together into a cohesive piece. So
it's your practice. You're practicing, even though you didn't know what the result, where you were going.
Yeah, and that's the thing is with graffiti quilting, you never plan out every single motif. You just take it one design at a time, and you live in that little space, and you quilt it, and then you move on with your life. And it's nice because then you can just enjoy the journey instead of being so focused on the end result. And every time you don't meet the criteria of the end result, you're mad at yourself. Or at least I was. I had huge trepidation about starting quilts because I was scared about the process. But with graffiti quilting, I was making it up as I went, so there was no wrong way. So I wanted to show you another one. So this is kind of getting a little more polished. So you can see where I'm starting to kind of combine different shapes together and see how they interact with each other. And you can even start to see some quilting motifs that I didn't know were quilting motifs because I hadn't started quilting yet. But now you can kind of see like plumes of feathers or kind of curly shapes. Obviously still very rudimentary, but it was just the way that my brain was kind of connecting the dots of how to get designs to play together, how to smush a lot of things into one space and have them all be friends. So,
right, a good way to put it.
So
Real good way.
after I was doing art for quite a while, the iPad Pro came out. And that like changed my life. Like if you are an avid drawer or sketcher, I would highly recommend getting an iPad because you don't waste any more paper. I wasted a lot of paper. It's easier to take with you everywhere. And it just is kind of nice to have everything contained and backed up onto a computer.
Yes,
my husband is a computer nerd, and he was like, what if our house burns down and all your sketchbooks are inside? And I thought, okay, well, I'll get an iPad and you can back it up somewhere and keep it safe. Yeah. So now I use my iPad and my pencil, and I can very easily draw and practice different designs all digitally, which is just kind of nice to have around. And now this is what I carry with me everywhere I go, just like it used to be with my sketchbooks and a cosmetic bag that didn't have cosmetics in it, but like 400 pens. Now I can just carry one pen and one sketchbook. So this is kind of nice because I can just use it as I would a sketchbook.
Oh.
But if I mess up, I can easily erase,
Bye-bye.
which is
Never
kind of nice
happened.
too. Yeah. Yeah, so I was drawing a lot and I was sketching, and then when I started quilting in 2009, I was just thinking to myself, like, why am I not quilting out all the designs that I learned? I remember learning very like simple motifs, you know, like swirls and circles and stuff, but thinking like, I already know how to draw. What's stopping me from drawing on my fabric? So that's kind of when graffiti quilting was born. So this is the very first copy, not like the very first actual copy, but the first iteration of graffiti quilting. This is kind of what it looked like. And this was published right after our first meeting when we did graffiti quilting. And it took off like wildfire.
Yeah.
Like it was kind of crazy. So after it was published in the fall of 2014, I started getting calls from people saying like, will you teach us? Will you teach a class? And I was like, I've always been a student.
Yeah.
Like, that was so crazy to me that people like wanted to hang out with me.
But you set it up. You put yourself there.
Yeah, so I ended up doing a whole international tour in the summer of 2015, and I went to England and Scotland and Ireland, and I did a tour along the southern coast of Australia and Canada, and then I went to Chicago and San Antonio.
And it's quilting, and quilting took
Right?
you all those places.
Right?
It's crazy.
It still blows my mind. People will say like, oh, where are you going? And I'll tell them, why are you going there? I'm teaching a quilting class. And they're like, okay. But yeah, it's kind of a dream come true. So I realized that after I had started teaching the class and getting more and more in depth, there was so much stuff that I could have put in the book had I realized.
Yeah.
Like it just was part of the process. So even the published book is kind of part of the process that my sketchbooks took. So in 2016, I gave the book kind of a whole new facelift where everything from the first book is in the second book, plus like another 40 pages worth of information. So it talks about all the same things about like building your toolbox and about how to kind of start combining designs together, but in a much more in-depth way. So yeah, and then my nieces and nephews saw all of my sketchbooks in my drawings in my sketchbook and wanted to color them, and I was like, you're not touching my sketchbooks, I'm sorry. So I made a coloring book for them, which now is kind of a great companion piece where quilters who have the book and kind of feel like they're getting in the groove, whenever they feel like they have a block, they can use the coloring book as a reference, and it's just 60 more designs that you can reference.
Great.
With
With dual purpose, really.
Right. Yeah, so some people will color them, some people will reference them, some people will do both. That's fine.
And these are self-published.
Yes, all my books are self-published.
Great.
Yeah, self-made woman.
Great. Yeah.
I try to be, at least.
Well, do we get to see some quilts?
Absolutely.
So this quilt looks familiar.
Yeah. This quilt is, well, I think will always be one of my favorites because this was the quilt that when I finished it, I realized that I was onto something. Like this was the first graffiti
Hold it up
quilting
so the
quilt
camera can see
that
it.
I knew
Wow.
was graffiti quilting. And so everything kind of jumped from there. And actually that's why I put it on the cover of my book, because that was like wow, this is a real thing. This isn't just me doodling on fabric anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this one is just very special to me because it really felt like a turning point in my quilting career. So I found that as I was graffiti quilting, sometimes it was kind of boring to just start in the center and keep working my way out with every single quilt. And I started to figure out that you could do these layouts, but still the graffiti quilting style. So things started to progress a little more where
I see what you're saying.
it started to get a little more organized. Like you can see that there's kind of a formula, there's kind of a process where I would do a central motif and then something kind of coordinating. And so it started to get a little more organized, which was something that was kind of nice, that there was some method to the madness a little bit. It wasn't just me smashing stuff together all the time. So then I started to figure out how I could possibly apply graffiti quilting in a more functional way. So like with longarm quilting, it's typical when you do an edge-to-edge design to start in one row and work your way down the quilt. And so I figured out how I could graffiti quilt, but starting in a line and working my way up a quilt as if I was on a long arm and trying to figure out how to do that on a long arm. And then I found that I could get it even a little more organized. So this quilt I really like. When I teach classes, I always have a student or two that feels like they just need a lot more constraining.
Yes, some structure.
Right, something to work off of. So this quilt is really fun to show because it's still graffiti quilting, but it's a little more organized for those analytical quilters who feel like they need a little more structure.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Draw between the lines.
Right. Yeah. A little more like interpretive, like with traditional quilting, you interpret a block, right? So it's kind of the same idea, but you still don't have to plan out the entire quilt.
Right.
From the beginning, you can take it one step at a time.
Right. That's so interesting, this progression.
Yeah.
Really,
It's
really
cool
is.
to see how you start to see that there's more formulas, there's even more controlled chaos.
Yeah.
It's not always just like as crazy as a lot of my quilts. So.
Good word. Controlled chaos is it.
And then I really liked getting experimental with my quilts. So this fabric, it's the type of fabric that you would make one of those refrigerator bags for like picnics, and you want your food to stay cold. It was on sale and it was shiny, so I bought it and I quilted it, and I really like how it turned out. Yeah, so it's kind of fun that it's not just cotton substrate. It's not, just the cookie cutter cotton fabrics that we have. You can get really crazy, obviously.
And you use the couching foot for that?
Yes, so I used, this is actually one skein of yarn that's variegated, so it looks like I changed my yarn color a lot, and I totally didn't. It's all one skein. I did try to plan out the motifs where once the color changed, I could move on. So I did kind of finagle it a little, but for the most part, I just kind of went with it. And
wow.
Yeah. So, and then this quilt is the same layout as the first one I showed you, but this was done 2 years later. So you can kind of see that there's a little more structure, a little more organization. Things are a little bit more symmetrical.
Balance, I'd say, is a lot of it. Yep.
Yeah, it's where the same technique was being used, but there was more control and kind of, I was a little more pragmatic with each specific element. So that is what went on.
Oh, that makes sense. Perfect sense.
Yeah, so the book was more pragmatic, and so was the quilt. So yeah, that's kind of a little crash course of the history. So let's actually do some quilting and drawing. So I wanted to show you how I prep my fabric, because that's one of the main questions I get asked is, well, what kind of fabric, what kind of thread, how do you baste it, blah, 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 blah. So I wanted to kind of show you what I do to get my quilt top ready.
Yep.
So people, the number one question that I get is, do you mark out every single design?
No, absolutely not.
One, because that's boring. Like, who wants to just trace over the same line all the time? It's the drawing would be the fun part, and then the quilting would become cumbersome. But I do mark my fabric so that I can get the structure down, but then I still can just go with the flow with each one. I like to use solid colored fabric always, just because the quilting is what shines, so I'm not gonna detract it with fabric print. But also because I quilt so densely, if I were to put that on a printed fabric, it would just get too messy and too kind of crazy.
And really, you're painting with thread.
Right.
Is what you're doing.
Right, yeah. So really it's the thread that's doing all the work. And then I also like to stick with either black or white fabric, just because when I use bright colored thread, if you use a colored fabric, you're gonna get color influence, where on your cone you might love this beautiful olive green, but then if you put it on purple fabric, it's not gonna look the same as it does on the cone. So with black and white fabric, you don't get that color influence that you get from colored fabric. So I like to stick to dark, like black, or really bright white, or even like a cream would be fine as well. So I use 2 layers of batting, because with the amount of quilting I do, you just need some bones behind all that muscle. So I like to use 2 layers of batting to give it that stiffness that it needs. I feel like I like my quilts to kind of stand up when they're done and be kind of really stiff, especially because they're mostly wall hanging. So the stiffer they are, the nicer they play on the wall, and they don't warp. And now I've brought my quilts all over the world teaching, and they've been folded and refolded and
they held
sometimes smushed, and they're holding up. So I'll just do my backing fabric and then 2 layers of batting and then my top. And then I have a couple like little tools in my little tool bag that I wanted to show you that kind of help prepping my fabric easier. So the first one, with sit-down quilting or domestic quilting, it's typical to baste your fabric before you begin so that you're not getting wrinkles. And I really like quilt basting spray, so I don't like to have to work around pins or stitches. So the quilt basting spray is really nice because I can just spray it once and then it just kind of stays where I put it the whole time, which is really nice. So as far as thread, there's so many choices out there between brand and weight and size and variegation. I typically like to use a 40 weight thread. So this particular thread is a 40 weight rayon, which I really like because it has the sheen of like an embroidery thread, but it quilts like quilting thread. So I like to put that in the top as well as my bobbin because I just like to match the back. So
that's true. A lot. Your quilts are very much both-sided.
Yeah.
You're always turning them over and looking at the back.
Yeah, I mean, because when you're quilting that densely, even if your tension is set perfect, sometimes you get French knots on the back, and that's fine. So I'd rather just have those French knots match the front. So I like rayon just because it has such a nice sheen to it. And then as far as batting, I just like really kind of stiff loft. Something that's going to give my quilt some real stability for what I'm about to put it through.
It's like a cotton.
Right. Yeah. Whatever it is, just 2 layers is always safer than 1. So, and then as far as marking my fabric, while I don't do much marking, I just have these awesome Bic 0.9 lead pencils, but then I bought a colored chalk that I can mark my fabric with, but it doesn't break, and then I don't have to sharpen a pencil.
Oh, that's
great. Yeah, so I like to just use my mechanical pencil with my colored chalk to mark. So
perfect. Then you're ready to go.
Right. So when I am getting ready to start quilting, like I said, you don't really have to plan out every single design. But I wanted to show you kind of how I would mark my quilt if I were starting in the center and working my way out, which is one of the main layouts of graffiti quilting. And basically what I do is I'll find the center of my fabric. So let's say the center is about right here. So I'll find the center of my fabric, and the next thing I want to do is determine how dense my quilting is going to be. So I'm a pretty dense quilter. I quilt densely. That's what I mean by that. I'm not dense, but my quilting is dense.
No, you're not dense.
So I like to quilt very dense. I like everything tight. It's like I don't know when to quit quilting, and I don't want to quit quilting. So what I would do is basically start my center, and this center circle would represent my center motif, which is typically a circle because we want our design to be circular. With graffiti quilting, every design builds on the previous, and so a circle is kind of the optimal shape to add things onto. And then from that point, I would just be doing one color, so I would just do a spiral outward. So I wouldn't want to get too big because that's going to determine my density. And so I would typically try to do my spiral outward about the same distance apart all the time. So it would kind of look like this. So see how even though my circle is getting bigger,
it's still the same distance
it's still
apart.
About as far apart with each.
So your density will be consistent.
Exactly. And then if I want to do like a background fill around the edges so that when I trim it up to make it square, I don't want to chop off any of my actual quilting. I'd rather chop off the filler design around the edge. So when I feel like the design is about as big as I would like it to be as a whole, then what I'll do is just close off my spiral like that. Now these markings are not going to be stitched down. Like we're never going to actually quilt over our markings. They just give us kind of a guideline. I call this layout the yellow brick road because all we'll do is follow the yellow brick road.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Wow. So this is the structure.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is all you have to do to get started. The hardest part is starting your project. Once you get started, it's not as scary. So I try to just give myself enough to get started so that while I'm quilting, I know where to go and I don't have to worry about that. So the two most common questions about graffiti quilting is, what do I quilt next? And where do I quilt next? So this completely answers the where do I go next. So let's talk about the what do I quilt next, because that's usually the harder question to answer. So,
well, since we're about to quilt, you need your zinger.
well, thank you. It's like a rite of passage.
I know it is,
Yeah,
absolutely.
We get to start quilting now. Okay, so with graffiti quilting, like I said, it's about building one thing on top of the next, right? So I'm just going to start in the middle of my fabric, and I'm going to start with a circular design, and then we'll just build off from there.
Okay.
So go ahead and pull up my thread. And I don't bury my threads because I'm lazy. So people ask me that, do you bury them or just tie them off? And I just tie them off.
It's a personal thing.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to give myself a nice center design. And I do overstitch quite a bit.
You like the emphasis of it?
Yeah, I like high contrast. So the more stitching, the more contrast you get. So I'm just going to try to make my circular design about the size of my center marking. This is about the only time that I actually quilt over the line that I marked. Okay, so now from here, I'm going to set my my maximum speed on my machine to like 35 or 40. That way I can just lead foot the pedal and I don't have to worry about my speed. I can just worry about my arms moving.
Okay.
So now that I have my center design, I'm just going to start adding things onto it, working my way along the yellow brick road.
Follow, 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 follow,
Follow the yellow brick road. Did that ever bug you watching Wizard of Oz when they would actually start in the very center of the yellow brick road?
Yeah.
Like, don't you think they can probably tell where it's going to go for a minute?
Right.
That always bugged me. Okay, so I'm just adding on, and see how I've kind of used that marking as a guideline? It's not set in stone, it's just there to help me guide me on my way.
And interesting how you are going over some of the lines and how interesting it makes it.
Right. Right, yeah.
It's like shading.
Exactly,
in a way.
yes. Overstitching is the quilting version of shading. Yeah, exactly. So now I'm going to add a new design and trying to fill that space. So I might fill it in and see how I'm overstitching the outer edge.
The outer edge.
And it's giving me a little more contrast.
Yep.
And we could even add quite a bit of contrast by doing fillers. So if I were to fill this in with zigzags,
you're right.
Now it's really going to stand out.
So when you started, you had kind of a few motifs that kind of worked for you, and you just kept adding to that?
Yeah, so the idea is that every motif you have is a tool in your toolbox, right?
Yep.
And the more tools that you have in your toolbox, the more interesting things you can make.
Yeah.
So every time I learned a new design, if I liked it, I would add it to my toolbox. And then as I start a new graffiti quilting quilt, I just pull that tool out and use it.
Wow.
So let's see. Let's add something that's pretty iconic to graffiti quilting, an arrow. That's one of my favorite things to put into quilting, just because I feel like it wasn't really in quilting before graffiti quilting started. I mean, unless you had like an arrow-themed quilt.
Yep.
So I like putting arrows in because it's saying that you are deliberately graffiti quilting.
Yep. So you're going along the yellow brick road, but you're not exactly on it. You're just going in that direction.
Yep,
it's not
I'm just
literal.
using it. Yeah, I'm using it as a guideline so that my overall quilt can be cohesive.
Yep.
But not constraining.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I'm making all my designs, all my motifs about the same size, right? Because that dictates the density. So every time I add something new, I try to be mindful of that density. Because obviously when you quilt a certain density in your quilt, it's going to determine how much your fabric shrinks.
Yep.
And if you have inconsistent density, then your quilt is not going to lay flat.
Yes.
So that's something to just be mindful of. I kind of learned that the hard way.
Oh, yeah.
Or I guess it should be logical, but for me it wasn't. And so it wasn't until I started quilting without uniform density that I learned that my quilts weren't laying flat, and that's why.
We always think we can defy the laws of nature.
I know. And I feel like with quilting, there are specific quilting rules that make sense structurally, but graffiti quilting is also kind of all about breaking the traditional rules of quilting, right? Like, I remember being told that, like, you shouldn't overstitch, that it's too thick for a bed quilt, but I'm not making a bed quilt, so that rule doesn't happen to matter. So, yeah, so there are some rules, and it's important to know what they are, but that way when you break them, you can defend yourself.
You have a real reason.
Right, you can say, yeah, I broke it on purpose.
Yep, this is why, and look at my result.
Right.
A different arrow.
So I did not plan this out, even though it looks like it. And the idea is that you don't have to plan it out. This quilt is not going to look exactly the same as any other quilt I've ever done. And that being said, every single quilt I've done, I could never duplicate and do again, just because I didn't plan it out.
But
so
even if
there's
you
no
tried,
pattern to follow.
You can't measure things.
Right.
Yeah.
And who would want to do that? Who wants to make the same quilt a million times?
That's right.
I don't.
Yep.
I've yet to make the same quilt maybe more than twice.
Yeah.
So I would continue on this path, just filling in, following the yellow brick road. And then when I get towards my edges, I might do some sort of maybe an echo or something to finish it, and then do a filler design, chop it, square it up, bind it, and
there you have your quilt.
Beautiful wall hanging.
Yep.
Yeah.
Did I hear that you have a quilt like this already done?
Yes. I would love to show it to you.
Great.
Okay. So check this out. If I had finished that quilt that we just started, it would look a lot like this. So notice that I started in the center of my fabric and worked my way out, adding designs one on top of the next, right? Every single design builds from the last. And then when I got as big as I wanted, I kind of finished it off with a nice echo, and then I added a background design, squared it up, and bound it.
And you have a quilt.
I have a little cute mini quilt that will go on my wall.
So Karlee, you've made a lot of quilts this size. Can you make a big one?
I'm glad you asked. So I recently made the biggest graffiti quilting quilt that I've ever made. So this one actually was a lot more in depth than just a solid piece of fabric and quilting. I designed it on my computer and printed it onto fabric and then quilted that. So this is kind of what the fabric looks like. Whoa. That'll give you a little sneak peek. So all of this graffiti quilting design work was done digitally and then printed, and then I took it to my quilting machine and enhanced it like a ton more.
Oh, wow.
So
it's layer on top of layer.
Yeah. So it's backing, batting, top, quilting, hot fix crystals, beads, couching, and binding.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's phenomenal. It
Thank
is absolutely
you.
phenomenal.
Thanks.
And I hear it's going to make an appearance at some little quilt show.
Yeah, just Houston.
Oh, that's all. Okay. Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it got juried and accepted into Houston International Quilt Festival, and it's going to hang in the show, and hopefully by the time you're watching this video, there will be a ribbon next to it.
Oh,
that's the goal.
Wonderful.
But yeah, so it'll hang in the show, and I am just excited and really proud of it. It's the most in-depth quilt that I've ever done.
Yeah.
It took me about 450 hours total. It took about 200 hours before I even printed the fabric, so all of the design work that went into it was super cumbersome, but very worth it. And then the quilting on top of it, and then I did couching with the couching feet, and then added hot fix crystals one by one, and each one takes like 8 to 10 seconds to put on. And then I did some hand beading work, put some beads along the bottom, bound it.
It's crazy. It's
Thank
just
you.
it's so wild and different.
Thank you.
Yeah. Are you going to Houston to see it?
I hope so. I'm putting vibes out in the universe that the stars will align and that I'll be able to go and see it hanging. So we'll just all keep our fingers crossed.
Oh, good luck.
Yeah.
Where can people find your books?
KarleePorter.com is kind of the hub for all of the things that I sell. You can find me on Instagram under Karlee Porter Design, and that's primarily where I share whatever I'm sharing. You can also follow me on Facebook under Karlee Porter Design. So Yeah, I'm
Great.
pretty easily accessible.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Karlee.
You're welcome.
You never know what's going to happen when you start doodling. Just
Right?
look here.
Right, people might fly you around the world and hang out with you.
Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on Quilt at the Longarm Quilting Show.
Handy Quilter, designed by a quilter for quilters.